Hello everyone, this is Rig. Welcome to another episode of the Vedic Age, and today we are going to discuss about the Rig Vedic Varna, woman and household. So in this video we are going to discuss about what was the social hierarchy followed in the Rig Vedic culture, what was the position of woman then, and what kind of household mechanisms functioned in the Rig Vedic era. So Varna in the Rig Veda. How was the Varna system in the Rig Veda? Now first of all, this is not to be confused with the Varna system where we get four classes of people: Brahmana, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Sudras in the later Vedic age. We are talking about Varna system in the Rig Vedic age where there were no four Varnas, but there was a division on the basis of wealth and power. So Varna often refers to color, suggesting a possible link to social hierarchy. So Varna, the word Varna refers to something like color, which suggests a link to social hierarchy in the Rig Vedic culture. Dasa and Dasayus are associated with darkness, possibly indicating a lower social status. So Dasa means servants. So dasas and dasayus are associated with darkness, possibly indicating a lower social status. Darkness means a lower social status. Now these servants in the form of dasas and dasyus are not to be confused with slaves. Here people worked by taking some form of payment from their owners. Hence, they cannot be considered as slaves. They were proper servants who worked on the basis of a payment system. Epithets like avarta, not performing sacrifices, and avarna, colorless or lacking bharna, are used to describe enemies. So enemies, there are two kinds of enemies described in Rig Veda. One is avarta. Avrata means who does not keep any vrata or who does not perform sacrifices, religious sacrifices. They are called as avrata. And avarna means people who do not belong to any varna. Hence they are described as Rig Vedic enemies. Next up we have the Krishna Tvaj is used for dasayus, which could mean dark skinned or metaphorically as dark or evil. So Krishna's Tvaj, the word Krishna means dark. Okay, so Krishna Tvaj is used for dasayus, for the servants, which could mean that they were dark skinned people, or metaphorically it can also mean as dark or evil. Now this Krishna is not to be confused with the later Vedic god Krishna. Here Krishna means something which is dark in color. Debate exists whether physical differences are implied or if epithets refer to cultural and linguistic differences. So we do not know yet whether these epithets are used to distinguish a person based on their physical appearance. It may have some implications while describing them because of a different culture or a different language. Next up we will know what are the interpretations we can draw from the Varna and the speech of the Rig Vedic culture. References to speech and mode of speaking used to distinguish dasas and dasayus from the Aryans. So as a parameter to distinguish Aryans and dasas, the Rig Vedic culture used to use speech as a parameter. Okay, so their differentiation from the dasas or the dasayus were based on the language they spoke. It is unclear and hostile speech of the enemies is noted, possibly indicating cultural differences. So according to the Rig Vedic Aryans, the speech of the enemies or the people who did not belong to their own culture are unclear and hostile. The Rig Veda describes the Dasa language as incomprehensible, highlighting the otherness. So according to the Rig Vedic people, the language of the dasas are incomprehensible, means which cannot be understood, which cannot be made any sense out of. Hence it was other language or the language of the enemies. The dasas are sometimes described as anasa. Here nasa means nose and anasa means without nose, which could mean noseless or faceless in a metaphorical sense. So their facial attributes may have been somewhat different to that of the people in Rig Vedic culture, hence they were called as anasa. The dasas were called as anasa. The term mridra vakya indicates a soft or melodious speech of the Aryans, contrasting the harsh pitch of their enemies. So according to the Aryans in the Rig Veda, the dasas had a language which was incomprehensible and it was unclear and hostile in nature, whereas their own language was midra vakya, which means that it was in the form of a melody. Thus they used to differentiate themselves with the dasas. Next up we have the social hierarchy in Rig Veda. What kind of social hierarchy is noticed in the Rig Veda? A lack of explicit mention of Varna for Brahmana and Kshatriya in family books of Rig Veda. As we have discussed in our early videos, the family books from book 2 to book 7 are the earliest portions of the Rig Veda, and there we find almost no mention of the terms Brahmana or Kshatriya in the form of a social hierarchy. Membership of the Brahmana group possibly based on rules like reciting hymns, not birth. So the caste system or the Varna system in the Rig Vedic time was not hereditary, and people who could recite hymns and were educated in the ancient traditions were considered to be members of the Brahmana group. The Purusha Sukta hymn in the book 10 outlines a fourfold Varna order as a later development. So the fourfold Varna order from the Purusha Sukta hymn in book 10 of Rig Veda is a later addition, and it was not a culture in the Rig Vedic age. Hence the fourfold Varna system did not exist in a hierarchy basis in the Rig Vedic culture. The Rig Veda 3, which means Mandala 3 of Rig Veda, and the lines 44 to 45 hints at a social mobility where a person could aspire to change vocations and roles. So the person's work or a person's varna was not based on the family they were born in. A person could change their vocations based on the roles they performed. So it was not fixed, it was not rigid. There was fluidity in the social hierarchical system. The fluidity of social roles in Rig Veda contrast with later stricter Vedic text. So this fluidity after the early Vedic age was non-existent, and system became very much rigid. Women, men and the household. How was the position of women to that in respect of men, and how did the household function together in early Vedic culture? The 19th century reformers idealized the Vedic age for women's status, challenging colonial narratives. So the nationalist historians in the 19th century idealized the Vedic age as the golden age for women's status, and this was done on one hand as to develop a self-confidence among the Indians and to challenge the colonial narrative that women were always oppressed in India. The worship of goddesses and a female hymn composers in Rig Veda does not equate to social power for women. So in Rig Veda we find existence of goddesses, and they are worshipped with huge hymns which have greater significance in Rig Veda, and also female hymn composers are found in Rig Veda, but that does not indicate to the fact that the position of women in the Rig Vedic society was very high. Only a minuscule proportion of him are attributed to women. Thus, it indicates to the fact that limited access to sacred learning. Only a little number of hymns are attributed to women in the Rig Veda, from where we can understand that the woman had very limited access to sacred learning. Women's role were largely domestic and they did not perform sacrifices independently. So women mainly did all the household and domestic activities, and the sacrifices performed in the Rig Vedic culture were not done independently by the woman. The Vedic household was patriarchal, with women enjoying relatively little control over resources. So Vedic household can be said to be patriarchal, where men held the power, and with the support of women, the woman relatively had very little control over the affairs of the resources. Gender relations in the Rig Vedic context. How was the relationship between the genders in the Rig Vedic era? Gender roles are culturally defined, with men engaged in public and political domains and women in the domestic domain. So just like the culture we find throughout the historical stories in all the civilizations, mostly the woman had a domestic domain and men were engaged in public and political domains in the Rig Vedic culture. The norms of conduct were based on gender, age and kinship relations. So what kind of social conduct the women used to follow were based on their gender, age and kinship relations, means familial relations. Women's control over sexuality and reproduction was regulated by the patriarchal structures. So the patriarchal structures decided the control, how much control would be there over women's sexuality and reproduction rate. The gender relations are a part of complex social pyramid with interlocking roles and expectations. So it was not that all the power rested among the men only. We find that the household decisions or the domestic affairs were controlled by the women with support of the men, and the decisive powers in the society were on the hands of men. The analysis of gender relations requires breakdown of women into more specific subcategories for accurate understanding. A lot of research has not been done in this field, and whether women only had a domestic role is a matter of debate, because new researches show that there were powerful women in the Rig Vedic culture and who played a vital role in the decisive factors of the society. Next up, we need to understand what kind of role was played by women in religious and social life, means the ritualistic role of women in the Vedic culture. The role of women in Vedic rituals and domestic life was regulated but significant, means their role was controlled, yet it was very much significant in the Vedic rituals of the time. The Rig Vedic hymns suggest women had presence in religious practices mediated by male relatives. So women had to be present in Rig Vedic sacrifice or yagyas. The woman had to be present, and their role was mediated by the other male relatives. So it has been also seen in Rig Vedic text that there are rules where while performing a sacrificial ritual, a woman's presence is very much necessary. Women's role in household governance is very much acknowledged, though within patriarchal bounds. So it is very much, women are assumed to have played a very much important role in household governance, and their role is very much treated with respect, though within patriarchal bounds, means they were controlled and supported by male members of the family. Women as active participants in society could occupy various roles, from performers to decision makers. So as active participants in the society, it has been seen that women could occupy various roles in the Rig Vedic culture, even the roles of decision making, from performers to decision makers. So they used to perform ritualistic practices, and also they used to take important decisions in the society. Despite patriarchal structures, Vedic literature indicates women's active agency in different aspects of life. So, even though it is assumed by contemporary historians that the structure of Rig Veda was patriarchal, but still it has been indicated repeatedly in Rig Veda that women had very significant and active agency in different aspects of Rig Vedic culture. Next up, we need to understand the Rig Vedic hymns and women's representation. How were women represented in the Rig Vedic culture? Out of over 1000 hymns in Rig Veda, only 12 to 15 are attributed to women, suggesting limited representation. Now there are over 1000 hymns, among them only 12 to 15 are attributed to women, suggesting that there is very much less representation of women in Rig Veda. No direct evidence of women as priests in Rig Veda has been found. Religious participation was alongside male counterparts. So, contemporary historians argue the fact that there is no direct evidence of woman as priest in Rig Veda, or one who conducts the the religious rituals in a sacrifice. They are called as priest. So there has been no direct evidence of women as priest in Rig Veda, but there was religious participation of women along with their male counterparts. Women's literary contribution was minimal, yet existence in Rig Vedic society. So even though it was very less, but there was literary participation of women in the Rig Vedic society. The hymns reflected the patriarchal structure where women's public religious roles were restricted. So hence the hymns of Rig Veda reflect a patriarchal structure according to contemporary historians, where women's religious roles are assumed to have been restricted within patriarchal bounds. The presence of powerful goddesses in Rig Veda show a complex view of feminine divine. So there was female divine deities in Rig Veda, and they are considered to be very powerful in the Rig Vedic culture. So that also shows a contrasting view to that of the patriarchal society in Rig Vedic culture. The power dynamics and gender in the Rig Veda. How the dynamic of power functioned in different genders of the Rig Vedic culture. Women's role in the Vedic age were not monolithic but varied based on context and class. So it cannot be said that whole day the women were busy in kitchen only. It cannot be said like that in Rig Vedic culture. It was not monolithic, means women did not perform a single activity only, and their range of occupation or their range of activities varied based on the context of the society or the class in which they belonged to. The presence of female deities in Rig Veda indicates a nuanced approach to divine feminine. So there has been indication or presence of female deities in Rig Veda, and they are considered to be very powerful, without whom the world or the universe will not function properly. Hence, it is this view about the female deities in Rig Veda contrast to the view of patriarchal society in Rig Veda. The proportion of hymns by women suggests some degree of access to sacred knowledge and cultural expression. So unlike other cultures of the contemporary period, the Rig Veda, even though in a very minimum amount, gave respect and power to women in the form of giving certain hymns in their sacred text dedicated solely to women power only. While women had roles in rituals, their autonomy was limited by the patriarchal norms of the time. So women had roles in rituals and they played very important part in the governance of the Rig Vedic culture, but still it is assumed that their role was their autonomy or their independence was limited by patriarchal norms of the Rig Vedic culture. The complexity of gender relations in Rig Veda calls for a nuanced analysis. So the complexity of gender relations, what kind of activities were reserved for each gender, or whether if at all they were reserved for a particular gender or not, this kind of conclusion can only be derived after a very detailed analysis of the sacred text. Next up, we need to go through the woman role in the society. The Vedic household was characterized by patriarchal norms according to the contemporary historians. It is not my view. I am merely presenting the facts from various important books of the ancient Indian historical periods. So, the Vedic household was characterized by patriarchal norms regulating women's sexuality and reproductive rights. So women could not procreate or reproduce based on their own will. Their reproductive rights and control towards women's sexuality solely resided on the male members of the family. Norms of conduct dictated women's behavior with an emphasis on purity and fidelity. Women were said to be very pure, and they were very much dignified in the Rig Vedic culture. Hence the norms of conduct of the woman were focused towards attaining a more purer form. The structure ingrained norms of what was appropriate for women, often linked to domesticity. So according to the Rig Vedic culture, the appropriate work for women was the domestic activities. Hence the structure of the norms that were dictated in Rig Veda often linked them towards the domestic activities. According to nationalist historians, women participated in Sabha and was important in decision making. So women played an important part in the decision making process, because according to the interpretations of Rig Veda by the nationalist historians, they participated in Sabha where important political decisions were taken. Despite these norms, there were avenues for women to exercise agency, though within constraints of their societal roles. So there were basing on the context of Rig Vedic culture, it is very much important to understand every culture with respect to the context. So basing on the context of the Rig Vedic culture, it can be assumed that women needed to have a secured place in the society. Therefore, they were bound to operate within certain limits. Now, whether that limit can be considered as a patriarchal dominance or a benefit of women's security, that needs to be analyzed in a very impartial and critical manner. Marriage and family in the Rig Veda. How were the marriage celebrations? How were the bondings of marriage with partners in the Rig Vedic culture? The Rig Veda contains references to monogamy, polygyny and polyandry, indicating varied marital practices. So different kind of marital practices existed in Rig Veda, where we find monogamy, polygamy and polyandry. So all kind of marriage practices existed in the Rig Vedic culture. Woman could remarry if her husband died. So this is very important. This is not accepted even in modern times in some traditional views. It is not accepted for a woman to remarry after her husband died. But in Rig Veda, it has been specifically mentioned that woman had the right to remarry if her husband died. And such instances have also been described in Rig Veda. Post-puberty marriages are mentioned, suggesting an emphasis on maturity of individuals entering marriage. So there was no practice of child marriage in Rig Veda, and Rig Veda prohibits marriage of women before they attain puberty. Hence, this is very much significant because it is very much rational and modern concept, basing on the fact that in order to have a marriage bond, the person should attain a certain level of maturity, and that level of maturity was fixed in Rig Vedic culture. There are references to women choosing their husbands, indicating in some degree of female agency in marriage decision. So there has been instances where we see women can select their husbands from different options available to them. Hence we can understand that women had an independent thought where they had some degree of agency in marriage decision, and this is very much significant because on the context of Rig Veda, which was based approximately 4000 years ago archaeologically from now, it is very much of an advanced phenomenon that women had a say in their marriage possibilities. The presence of love songs and wedding hymns reflect the cultural importance of marriage in Vedic society. So there we find existence of love songs and wedding hymns, which reflects that marriage was a very much significant cultural event in the life of a person in Rig Vedic times. The social mobility and aspirations of Rig Veda. How was the social mobility and what were the aspirations of the Rig Vedic culture? The Rig Veda presents a society where aspirations could transcend from one's immediate social role. So there was fluidity in vocations or fluidity in the activities a person could do. Hence, one could transcend from one's immediate social role. Hymns speak of desires for wealth, status, and knowledge, suggesting a dynamic social structure. So there was existence of wealth, and people had an affinity to acquire wealth because it gives them status, and knowledge was also considered to be an important asset in the Rig Vedic time. Hence we understand that there was a dynamic social structure. The appeal to gods for changing one's social role indicates a belief in the possibility of altering one's destiny. So people used to appeal to gods to gain certain favors, which indicates that there was a belief in altering one's future, in altering one's destiny. People used to trust in the deity, and they used to have trust that the deity will take care of them, and for that they had different ritualistic religious activities. Evidence suggests that men could aspire to become sages or achieve different vocations, indicating some fluidity in social roles. So invocation, the right to invoke a god or to right to invoke any supernatural power, was not based on birth. It was based on the capability of a person, and there is evidence in Rig Veda where a person who is doing some other work can choose to become sage, or a divine can choose to have some divine aspiration towards oneself. The concept of karma or actions affecting one's status seems to be in its nascent form, hinting at social mobility based on deeds. So we find primitive existence of the philosophy of karma, where it says that if you do good deed, good things will happen to you, and if you do bad things will happen to you. So this philosophy was in its very nascent forms, focusing on the fact that people had a belief on someone's good or bad deeds. Now, gender roles and the ideology of power. What were the roles attributed to certain genders, and how was the ideology of power in Rig Vedic times? Power and authority within the family and society were distributed along gender lines, with male holding public and political power with the support of women. So male used to play a physical role in the society where security was the main concern. Hence, men held public and political power, and that was supported by the women, who also held a considerable amount of agency in the society. The norms of conduct were established in order to maintain this power structure, and women largely relegated to domestic sphere. So in order to maintain this structure, there were laws or norms of conduct, as we say it, in the society, and where women were designated the role, a vital role in the domestic sphere, where men played public and political functions. Relationships within the family and household were governed by these norms, impacting daily lives of women. So all the relationship within the family and that of the society were indicated with the governance of these norms of conduct, and thus it impacted the daily lives of women in the Rig Vedic culture. The control of women's sexuality and reproductive capabilities was key aspect of maintaining the social order. So control of women's sexuality was very much emphasized upon in Rig Veda, and the ability to procreate or the reproductive capabilities of women was very much significant, or it was the key aspect of maintaining social order in the Rig Vedic culture. These patriarchal norms form the basis of complex social hierarchy evident in Rig Vedic society. So these norms of conduct were the skeleton of the Rig Vedic culture, which housed every kind of important traditions and rituals in the early Vedic period. Now, analyzing gender relationships in Rig Veda. Gender relations in Rig Veda are complex. It cannot be said that a fixed kind of activity were done by women or a fixed kind of activity were done by men only, and thus it requires a detailed analysis beyond simplistic categorization. So we cannot categorize a occupation based on their gender, or we cannot categorize a gender on the basis of the occupation they did. So it requires a complex and detailed analysis. Women's role were not just limited to domestic sphere, they were also significant in religious activities and sometimes also in decision making, and all this happened under male supervision. The analysis should account for an active participation of women in society, challenging the narrative of their complete subordination. So, there is a narrative that women were completely subordinates of men, and there is also a narrative that women had active participation in society with the support of men. Now, which one is correct? That needs to be analyzed in detail from the sources available to us of the Vedic period. The study of Rig Veda provides insight into historical progression of gender roles in ancient society. So from the Rig Veda, we understand a lot about the gender roles in ancient Indian society. The active roles of women in various social spaces indicate their diverse capabilities and contributions to Vedic culture. Thus, we can understand that women, even though it has been mentioned numerous times in Rig Veda that they were the participants of domestic activities only, but also there are mentions in Rig Veda where women played a significant role in all of the spheres of the society. Hence, their activities were diverse with diverse capabilities, and thus they contributed very significantly in the Vedic culture. Concluding overview. Here we will discuss about whatever we have learned through this presentation. Hence, we will provide a summary of the entire presentation. The concept of Varna in Rig Veda is very complex, with interpretations ranging from our color symbolism to social hierarchy. So the concept of Varna was not at all rigid, it was very much fluid, and the Varna of a person depended may have depended on their skin color or their physical attributes or their wealth in the social hierarchy. Epithets for enemies have been found, like dasas and dasayus, suggest a distinction based on cultural and linguistic differences, not merely on skin color. So this distinguishing factor between the Rig Vedic people and the enemies of the Rig Vedic people were not merely on physical attributes or skin color, it was also based on culture and the language they spoke. The social structure during the Rig Veda period was very much fluid, with hymns indicating possibility of social mobility and aspiration. So a person doing certain work may change their mode of occupation for their subsistence, or a person can aspire to have a spiritual philosophy and become divine sages. So there was a mobile social structure with possibility and aspiration. Rig Vedic society recognized different roles for women, from participation in rituals to references in hymns indicating various degrees of agency. So we cannot conclude, even though I have said in this presentation that the Rig Vedic society was patriarchal, we cannot definitely make a conclusion out of that fact, because women have been recognized to have diverse role in the early Vedic culture. Despite patriarchal norms, as I have said, Vedic texts provide evidence of women's significant role in household governance and religious life. So, the role of women has to be judged on the context of Rig Vedic culture, and their security was an important factor. Therefore, it was probably because of security that women had some kind of restrictions in the society, but that security cannot be equated with the patriarchal or the patriarchal domination in the society. The gender relations in Rig Veda are multifaceted, requiring a break from monolithic interpretations to understand the nuanced role of men and women. So we cannot go into a linear analysis about the roles men or women played in the society, because both played part and significant part in diverse activities of the culture. The transition from Rig Vedic era to later periods shows a trend towards more rigid social structures and defined gender roles. So after the Rig Vedic period, as we move forward into Indian history to more recent times, we find that there has been a tendency for the society to become more rigid with specific codes of differences among people. The evolution of societal norms from Rig Veda to later Vedic texts reflects broader cultural transformation. So there was a broad cultural transformation from the Rig Vedic time to later Vedic time, and as we move forward in Indian history. So that was all about Rig Vedic Varna system, position of women, and the household culture in the early Vedic era. Hope you liked the video, and whatever I am saying in these videos are merely a presentation of facts which I have acquired from different books of ancient Indian history. So do not take my opinion to be supreme. You go through your own sources and make out your own analyzations. Thus, history is always a very fluid subject with new researchers coming along, and I will very much appreciate if you provide me with updates regarding the current information about the topic which I will discuss. Thank you very much, and as usual, support me so that I can bring brighter contents in future. Thank you.